What happens when one of Hollywood's most uncompromising directors sits down with a late-night host who thinks he can outsmart him? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive confrontation between Quentin Tarantino and Jimmy Kimmel that ended with security escorting the legendary filmmaker off the set. This wasn't your typical celebrity interview. This was a masterclass in how not to handle a guest who refuses to play by your rules. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below telling me what you think really went down behind the scenes, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about late-night television. The tension was palpable from the moment Quentin Tarantino walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel live set. Fresh off promoting his latest film, the director had agreed to what he thought would be a straightforward interview about his craft, his inspirations, and his decades-long career in Hollywood. What he didn't expect was Jimmy Kimmel's decision to turn the conversation into a personal attack disguised as entertainment. Kimmel started innocently enough, welcoming Tarantino with his usual theatrical enthusiasm. The audience applauded as the director settled into the guest chair, his signature black suit perfectly pressed, his demeanor relaxed but alert. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. Kimmel asked about the new film. Tarantino responded with his characteristic passion and intelligence, and the audience was clearly engaged. But then Kimmel made his first mistake. Instead of continuing with the film discussion, he suddenly shifted gears, pulling out a stack of papers from his desk. "You know, Quentin," Kimmel said with a smirk that should have been a warning sign, "I've been doing some research on you, and there are some things I think our audience would love to hear about." Tarantino's expression immediately changed. The relaxed filmmaker straightened in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the host's face. "Research?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of skepticism. "What kind of research are we talking about here, Jimmy?" Kimmel's grin widened, and it was clear he thought he had the upper hand. This was his show, his turf, and he was about to demonstrate his power over even the most respected guests. "Well," he began, shuffling through his papers with exaggerated importance, "I've been looking into your early career, and there are some interesting stories about your time working in video stores. Some people might say you were just a clerk who got lucky." The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the light-hearted banter they expected from a late-night talk show. Even they could sense that something was wrong with this line of questioning. Tarantino, however, remained calm, though his jaw had tightened imperceptibly. "A clerk who got lucky," Tarantino repeated slowly, his voice level but with an undercurrent of steel. "Is that what you think, Jimmy? That decades of studying film, writing screenplays, and creating some of the most influential movies of the past 30 years was just luck?" Kimmel leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying what he perceived as his guest's discomfort. "I'm just saying, not everyone who works in a video store becomes a famous director. Some might say you had some help along the way, maybe some connections that other people didn't have." The implication was clear, and it was insulting. Kimmel was suggesting that Tarantino's success wasn't earned through talent and hard work, but through nepotism or favoritism. It was exactly the kind of lazy, uninformed criticism that serious artists face from people who have never created anything meaningful themselves. Tarantino leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "Jimmy," he said, his voice still controlled but with a dangerous edge, "I need to stop you right there. I came on your show to talk about my work, not to defend my entire career against some half-baked conspiracy theory you cooked up in your writer's room." But Kimmel wasn't backing down. If anything, Tarantino's pushback seemed to embolden him. "Hey, I'm just asking the questions our audience wants answered," he said, gesturing toward the crowd. "People are curious about how Hollywood really works, about who gets opportunities and why." "No," Tarantino said firmly, "you're not asking questions the audience wants answered. You're creating a narrative that doesn't exist because you think it makes for good television. But here's the thing, you're wrong. The atmosphere in the studio had completely transformed. What started as a routine celebrity interview had become something much more serious, and everyone in the room could feel it. The audience sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether they were witnessing genuine conflict or elaborate performance art. But Tarantino's expression made it clear that this was no act. Kimmel, however, seemed oblivious to the shift in mood. Perhaps he was too caught up in his own perceived cleverness, or maybe he genuinely believed he was providing his audience with compelling television. Either way, he pressed forward with his attack. "Look, Quentin," Kimmel said, his tone becoming more condescending, "I think you're being a little sensitive here. I'm not attacking you. I'm just trying to give people a more complete picture of who you are. You can't expect to come on television and only talk about the things you want to talk about." Tarantino's eyes flashed with anger, but his voice remained steady. "Actually, Jimmy, that's exactly what I can expect. When you invite someone onto your show, there's an implicit agreement that you're going to treat them with basic respect. What you're doing right now isn't journalism, it's not entertainment, it's just mean-spirited nonsense." But Kimmel wasn't finished. He reached for another piece of paper from his stack, clearly prepared to escalate further. "Well, since we're talking about respect, let's discuss some of the criticism you've faced over the years. Some people have called your movies gratuitously violent. Others have questioned your use of certain language. Don't you think it's time to address these concerns?" The question was loaded with malicious intent. Kimmel wasn't genuinely interested in Tarantino's artistic choices or the deeper themes in his work. He was trying to bait the director into a defensive position, hoping to create a viral moment at his guest's expense. Tarantino sat back in his chair, and for a moment, the studio was completely silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with controlled fury. "You know what, Jimmy? I've been doing interviews for over 20 years, and I've answered those questions more times than I can count. I've explained my artistic vision, I've discussed the cultural context of my work, and I've engaged in serious conversations with journalists who actually understand what they're talking about. But you're not interested in any of that, are you?" Kimmel tried to interrupt, but Tarantino held up a hand, his patience finally exhausted. "No, let me finish. You brought me here under false pretenses. You told my people this would be a standard promotional interview, but instead, you've turned it into some kind of ambush. You're not asking questions because you want to understand my work, or give your audience insight into the creative process. You're asking them because you think controversy equals ratings." The host's facade finally began to crack. His artificial smile faltered, and for the first time, he seemed to realize that his plan was backfiring spectacularly. "Quentin, I think you're overreacting," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "This is just normal interview stuff. Every talk show host asks tough questions." "Tough questions?" Tarantino laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Jimmy, a tough question would be asking me about my influences, or my writing process, or how I developed a particular character. What you're doing is trying to diminish my accomplishments and create drama where none exists. That's not journalism. That's just bad television." The director stood up from his chair, and the audience audibly gasped. This was unprecedented. Guests simply didn't walk out on Jimmy Kimmel Live. But Tarantino wasn't just any guest, and he wasn't going to tolerate being disrespected on national television. "You know what the real problem is here, Jimmy?" Tarantino said, looking down at the host who suddenly seemed much smaller behind his desk. "You've gotten so used to celebrities playing along with your little games that you forgot you're dealing with someone who actually has integrity. I don't need your show, I don't need your approval, and I certainly don't need to sit here and listen to you try to tear down everything I've worked for just to get a few cheap laughs." Kimmel finally seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. His face had gone pale, and he was frantically looking toward his producers for guidance. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. Celebrities were supposed to smile and play along, no matter how uncomfortable the questions became. But Kimmel's panic only seemed to fuel his desperation, and instead of backing down or apologizing, he made the worst possible decision. He doubled down. "Wait, wait, wait," Kimmel said, his voice rising as he tried to regain control of the situation. "You can't just walk away from this, Quentin. You came on my show, and now you're throwing a tantrum because I asked you some legitimate questions. What are you afraid of?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the studio held their breath waiting for Tarantino's response. The director slowly turned back toward the host, his expression now completely transformed. Gone was any pretense of politeness or professional courtesy. This was Quentin Tarantino at his most dangerous, a man whose intelligence and passion had been weaponized by righteous anger. "What am I afraid of?" Tarantino repeated, his voice now carrying the full weight of his fury. "Jimmy, the only thing I'm afraid of is that people watching this might actually think you're a competent interviewer. Let me explain something to you, since you seem to be confused about how this works. I've created films that have influenced an entire generation of filmmakers. I've written dialogue that people quote decades later. I've built a career on taking risks and pushing boundaries while maintaining artistic integrity. You, on the other hand, make jokes about celebrities' personal lives and think that qualifies as entertainment." The host tried to interrupt, but Tarantino wasn't finished. "You want to talk about being afraid? Let's talk about your fear, Jimmy. You're afraid that without manufactured controversy, your show is boring. You're afraid that without attacking your guests, you don't have anything interesting to say. You're afraid that people might realize the emperor has no clothes." Kimmel's face had gone from pale to red with embarrassment and anger. "You don't get to come on my show and insult me," he snapped, his professional demeanor completely abandoned. "This is my house. These are my rules. And if you don't like it, you can leave." "Oh, I'm absolutely going to leave," Tarantino replied, his voice now calm but still deadly serious. "But first, let me leave your audience with something to think about. This man just demonstrated exactly what's wrong with modern media. Instead of using his platform to celebrate creativity, to explore ideas, or to have genuine conversations with interesting people, he chose to tear someone down for his own amusement. That's not entertainment. That's just sad." The director began walking toward the edge of the stage, but Kimmel wasn't ready to let him go. In a move that would haunt his career for years to come, the host stood up and called out, "Security! Don't let him leave until we finish this interview." The studio erupted in chaos. Security guards, confused and uncomfortable with the unprecedented situation, hesitated before slowly moving toward the stage. Tarantino stopped walking and turned back one final time, his expression now a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "You're actually going to have me escorted out because I won't let you humiliate me on national television?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise of the confused audience. "Jimmy, this is the most pathetic thing I've ever witnessed in my entire career. You've just proven every point I made about your character and your show." As security reluctantly approached, Tarantino raised his hands and smiled for the first time since the interview began. "Don't worry, gentlemen. I'm leaving voluntarily. I wouldn't want to stay another second in a place where intelligence and integrity are treated like diseases." He walked off the stage with his dignity intact, leaving behind a stunned audience, a humiliated host, and what would become one of the most talked-about moments in late-night television history. Kimmel sat behind his desk, his face a mask of shock and embarrassment, finally understanding that he had just destroyed his own reputation in front of millions of viewers. The silence in the studio was deafening as the reality of what had just happened settled over everyone present. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't good television. This was just a cautionary tale about what happens when ego and ignorance collide with talent and principle. What did you think about this incredible confrontation? Do you believe Kimmel crossed the line, or was Tarantino overreacting? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes Hollywood stories that you won't hear anywhere else. What other celebrity interviews do you think went too far?